Fernandez walked into my kitchen like he owned it. I guess in his mind he did. We sat across from each other at the mahogany table I'd bought 30 years ago with money I'd earned from my own 2 hands. He wouldn't look me in the eyes. That's how I knew something terrible was coming. "Mom," he started, his voice smooth like honey, fake honey. "It's time you rest. You're embarrassing yourself." The words hit different than yelling ever could. Embarrassing. As if I'd tripped in public or forgotten myself. As if I was becoming a problem nobody wanted to discuss at dinner. I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't cry. Not yet. What I didn't know that morning was that he'd planned this conversation for months. That there were meetings I wasn't invited to. That my own children had been preparing to push me aside like old furniture. I just sat there staring at his face. The face I'd wiped clean as a baby. The face that once looked at me like I was everything. "Embarrassing," I whispered back. That word followed me home and into my dreams for weeks. I couldn't sleep that night. Instead I walked through my house like a ghost, touching things. The kitchen where I'd cooked 10,000 meals. The living room where Fernandez had learned to read on my lap. The hallway where photographs showed our family. All of us smiling, all of us together. Every sacrifice rushed back. The missed meals because I'd given my portions to my children. The sleepless nights waiting for Fernandez to come home safely. The jewelry I'd sold. My grandmother's necklace, my wedding earrings, just to pay his school fees when money got tight. I'd built this life from nothing. I'd built him from nothing. And somehow, standing in my own house, it felt like it belonged to everyone but me. The furniture wasn't mine anymore. The memories weren't safe anymore. Even the air felt like it was being shared with strangers. I sat on the sofa in the dark and finally let myself break. Not loud. Never loud. Just the quiet kind of crying that comes when you realize something precious is slipping away and your hands are too weak to hold it. Love doesn't disappear loudly. It erodes quietly, like water wearing down a stone. The changes happened so fast I could barely keep up. Fernandez started answering questions meant for me. At family dinners, someone would ask about my business decisions from years ago, and suddenly his voice would cut through mine. "What Mom means is," he'd say. Except I hadn't finished speaking yet. He corrected my memories. When I mentioned how I'd convinced my first business partner to take a risk that paid off, Fernandez interrupted. "That's not how it happened, Mom. You almost lost everything. Dad saved you." My husband had been dead for 8 years. He was rewriting history in real time. He finished my sentences with lies. Small ones. Big ones. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd watch people's faces change as they believed him instead of me. His voice was louder. His confidence was unshakable. And I was old. Old people forget things, right? I felt myself being erased while still standing in the room. Christiana, my daughter, she'd nod along with his stories. James would look away. Even my closest friends started treating me differently, like I was becoming unreliable. And maybe that's what he wanted. Maybe erasing my credibility was easier than erasing me. "We're just worried about you, Mother." That's what Christiana said when she first brought it up. She whispered it like it was a secret, like she was protecting me from myself. James wouldn't meet my eyes when I asked him directly. He just said, "You've been forgetful lately, don't you think?" I hadn't forgotten a single thing. I remembered his first words. His favorite foods. Every promise he'd ever broken. Then Bob, Fernandez's oldest friend, someone I'd known for 30 years, suggested a checkup. A doctor's appointment. "To make sure I was okay upstairs," he said, tapping his head with that fake smile. I wasn't sick. I was being edited out of my own life. And they were making it sound like it was for my own good. That night, I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. When had I started looking like someone people pitied? When had my confidence turned into something that needed to be checked? I was still me. I was still sharp. I was still here. But they were building a story where I wasn't. A story where Margaret was fading. Where age had finally caught up with me. Where I couldn't be trusted anymore. I decided right then that I would prove them wrong. Not by fighting back. Not yet. I'd be smarter than that. The meeting happened on a Tuesday. I found out about it on Wednesday. Decisions were being made about my role in the business, a company I'd started from nothing. They discussed my finances, money I'd earned. They debated my future, a future that should only belong to me. And they did all of this in a room where I wasn't sitting. Christiana mentioned it casually, like she was telling me about the weather. Oh, we had a quick chat about restructuring your position. Nothing major. Except it was everything. They were taking away my titles, my responsibilities, my voice. My power wasn't being stolen loudly. It was being stolen while I was making tea in another room. I realized something that day that changed everything. That's how power really leaves you. Not in a dramatic explosion. Not in a confrontation where you can defend yourself. Power leaves quietly, in rooms you're not invited to, decided by people you thought loved you. I'd spent 60 years building authority. And they were taking it down brick by brick, while acting like they were doing me a favor. That's when I stopped being angry. Anger was what they wanted. It made old women look crazy. Instead I got quiet, got careful, got strategic. Mercy didn't defend me. That hurt worse than anything Fernandez had done. My daughter, the one I'd carried for 9 months, the one I'd taught to be strong, the one who said she'd always have my back, just watched. She didn't attack me. She didn't stand beside her brother and argue against me either. She just existed in this gray space of silence, and that silence was devastating. When I asked her directly, she looked away. I don't want to pick sides, Mom, she said. But choosing not to choose was still a choice. It was choosing them. It was choosing to be safe instead of loyal. The worst part was that I understood. Fernandez held the keys now. He controlled money. He controlled information. He controlled whether she'd stay in his good graces. Going against him meant risking everything. So she did what people do when they're scared. She disappeared. That quiet betrayal, that was the one that actually broke something inside me. Not the anger broke it. Not the fear. It was the realization that my own daughter wouldn't risk anything for me. I looked at her across the table and barely saw her anymore. She'd become a stranger who happened to share my face. I found the first proof by pure accident. Forwarded email. Fernandez had left his laptop open. Careless, confident, too sure of himself. I wasn't snooping. I was just checking if anyone had called while he was in the bathroom. But there it was, right there on the screen. A conversation between him and James. One sentence. That's all I needed. Once she steps aside, everything is easier. My hands started shaking. Not from fear. From clarity. This wasn't about me being forgetful. This wasn't about worrying for my health. This was about power. This was about control. This was about them deciding that an old woman was in their way. I didn't close the laptop. I photographed it with my phone. My old hands steadied themselves. I'd spent my whole life solving problems. Well, I had a problem now, and I was going to solve it the same way I solved everything, with intelligence and patience. That one sentence told me everything. Told me the timeline. Told me this wasn't spontaneous. Told me that while I was making their dinners and pretending not to notice, they'd been planning. I put the phone back in my pocket and walked calmly downstairs. The plaque came off my office door on a Thursday morning. I watched from the hallway as someone, I never did find out who, unscrewed the brass plate with my name, founder and director. It took them 2 minutes to erase 30 years of work. 2 minutes. My desk was reassigned. My files were moved into a small storage room, temporarily. My email signature was changed without asking me. My legacy wasn't destroyed, it was archived, boxed up. Stored away like something nobody needed to see anymore. I stood there watching it happen, and I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't do anything except watch. That's when I stopped crying entirely. Something shifted inside me that morning. It was like a door closing on the person I'd been. The soft Margaret, the one who apologized for her own existence, the one who asked permission to be here. She walked into that office and never came back out. The woman who left that office was different, colder, clearer. dangerous in ways only time and wisdom can make you. I'd spent my whole life being accommodating, being nice, being the kind of woman people took advantage of and called kind. Not anymore. I started documenting everything. Words spoken, expressions on faces, contradictions between what they said in my presence and what they said when they thought I wasn't listening. I wrote down every decision made without me. Every conversation I wasn't invited to but found out about anyway. Every promise they broke. Notebook. Simple. Blue cover. I kept it hidden in my closet behind my winter coats. Page by page I built a record of the truth. The date Fernandez told me he'd increased business revenue. And the email where he said I'd gotten the numbers wrong. The day Christiana said she was worried about me. And the text to James where she laughed about how Mom's becoming invisible. They thought I was fading. That's what they wanted to believe. An old woman losing her grip. Becoming irrelevant. But I wasn't fading. I was recording. I was watching. I was remembering everything they thought I'd forgotten. Every night I'd read back through those pages and feel stronger. Not angry. Stronger. Because knowledge is power. And I was gathering it all. Fernandez got overconfident. That's what people do when they think they've won. He laughed louder at dinners. Spoke bolder in meetings. Meetings I was still technically invited to but where nobody asked my opinion anymore. He made promises he couldn't keep about expanding the business, about bringing in investors, about his grand vision for something I'd created. I watched him spin stories about how he was the real genius behind the company. How he'd been carrying it all along. How I'd just been the ideas person, but he was the real businessman. I listened without reacting. Without defending myself. I just kept my notebook full and my mouth closed. His confidence became arrogance. His success, which was built on my work, my reputation, my years, became his justification for erasing me. He was so sure he'd already won. He was so certain I'd stay quiet. He didn't know about the email. He didn't know about my photographs. He didn't know that I was still the same woman who'd built everything from nothing. I'd just gotten smarter about how I'd do it again. Overconfidence is loud. Truth is quiet. And I was learning to be very, very quiet. Chris asked me something nobody else had asked in years. We were sitting in her car after a family event. She wasn't my daughter. She was a friend of Mercy's who'd known the family forever. She turned to me in the parking lot and asked the one question that broke something open. Margaret, do you know what you're worth? Nobody had asked me that since my husband died. Since I'd started apologizing for taking up space. Since I'd learned to make myself smaller so everyone else could fit. I didn't answer right away. Couldn't. I just stared at the dashboard with tears streaming down my face because suddenly I knew I'd forgotten. Somewhere along the way, between being a mother and being betrayed, I'd forgotten my own value. Yes, I finally whispered. I do. And I meant it. I knew exactly what I was worth. I was worth respect. I was worth loyalty. I was worth more than being pushed aside by people who owed everything to me. That conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it changed the trajectory of everything. Chris held my hand and reminded me that I didn't need their permission to be important. I didn't need Fernandez's approval. I didn't need Christiana's defense. I didn't need anyone's validation to know my own value. They tried to take my savings, family meeting, presentation, a temporary measure, while they restructured. They wanted access to my accounts. They wanted me to sign paperwork giving them control. They dressed it up in language that sounded reasonable. Language that sounded like it was for my own good. For your future care, Fernandez said. To protect your assets, James added. While we get everything organized, Christiana finished. I listened to every word. I watched their faces. I saw how they expected me to just sign. How they thought at 60 I'd be too tired to fight. Too confused to understand what they were really doing. I signed nothing. But I watched everything. I called my lawyer the next day. A lawyer they didn't know about. We went through the paperwork together. We looked at their real plan. And what I found made my stomach turn. They weren't just consolidating my accounts. They were positioning themselves to take control completely. After a certain amount of time, I'd be legally unable to access my own money. I'd have to ask Fernandez for permission to spend what I'd earned. That's when I understood something crucial. This wasn't about love anymore. If it ever had been. This was pure theft, wrapped in concern and delivered with smiles. I let them think I was done fighting. I dressed plainer. Wore the tired clothes Fernandez said made me look more my age. Spoke less in meetings. Agreed faster with whatever Christiana suggested. I made myself into the version of Margaret they were trying to create. The woman they wanted to erase. They relaxed when I did this. I could see it on their faces. The relief that they wouldn't have to deal with resistance. That I was finally understanding my place. That I was fading quietly, the way they'd planned. I became invisible on purpose. And that's when I truly became dangerous. Sometimes weakness is camouflage. Sometimes retreat is strategy. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people believe they've already won. I watched Fernandez get comfortable. Watched him start making decisions that wouldn't have happened if I was still the person he feared. Watched him take credit for things he never touched, involving himself in details he never understood. He was getting sloppy, confident, sure of himself. He had no idea that I was still there, still watching, still remembering, still building. I found documents Fernandez didn't know existed, not by accident this time, by looking, by searching his office when he was in meetings, by learning how to access emails he thought were deleted, by becoming the person I'd never needed to be. Someone willing to cross lines. Transfer records. Company assets moved to accounts with his name on them. A lie, a documented written down lie, tied directly to him. Fraud technically, theft really. But it wasn't just about me. I found evidence of him doing the same thing to other people. Business partners, employees, people who trusted him the way I did. Copied everything onto a flash drive. Everything. And sitting on my bed with that small piece of technology in my hands, I made a decision. Not a decision to destroy him. Not exactly. But a decision to make him answer for what he'd done. To everyone. I sat in my room and tried to remember who I'd been before they made me forget. Before motherhood. Before marriage. Before I learned to apologize for existing. I closed my eyes and went back to the girl I'd been at 25. Bold, smart, hungry to build something. Afraid of nothing. I was a builder. That was my real superpower. Not being nice. Not being accommodating. Being able to create something from nothing. Being willing to work harder and dream bigger than anyone else in the room. That woman was still inside me. 60 years old, older, wiser, but still there. Still capable. Still dangerous to anyone who tried to dismiss her. I pulled out my mirror and looked at myself for the first time in months. Not the old woman they'd made me feel like. The builder. The woman who'd done impossible things. The woman who'd raised children and built companies and survived more than most people face in a lifetime. She looked back at me from the mirror. And she was ready. Johnson, Fernandez's right-hand man, tried to warn him. I overheard them in the hallway outside my room. Johnson's voice was nervous. I think your mother's planning something. Fernandez laughed. Actually laughed. She's 60 years old, Johnson. What's she going to do? That's how little he understood me. That's how completely he'd underestimated the woman who'd given him life. Johnson tried again. The numbers don't add up. I think she might. Forget it, Fernandez cut him off. She's finished. We won. He didn't listen to Johnson's warning. He never does. That's the thing about people like Fernandez. The louder they are, the less they actually hear. Pride makes people deaf. The loudest people hear the least. I walked past them to the kitchen like I hadn't heard a thing. But I'd heard. And I was smiling on the inside. The event was a charity gala. Big one. The kind where everyone important in the city showed up. The company was being recognized for business excellence. A joke considering what I knew about how that business was really run. They didn't expect me to be there. Fernandez had mentioned it in passing, probably hoping I wouldn't remember. Christiana had gently suggested I might be too tired for something so formal. James had simply stopped inviting me to things like this months ago. But I was there, dressed better than I had in years. Hair done, makeup perfect. The Margaret nobody recognized anymore because they'd expected her to disappear. I watched their faces when they saw me. The shock. The quick calculation of whether this was a problem. It was definitely a problem. They gave me a chance to speak. The organizers didn't know the family drama. They didn't know about the erasing or the lies or the careful destruction of an old woman's life. They just knew I was the founder. So they asked if I had any words. I walked to that microphone with my hands steady and my voice steady. And I told them the truth. I talked about betrayal. About children who learned from their parents that you could take everything from someone and call it love. I talked about ageism. How society teaches us that at 60, women become invisible. I talked about what happens when people assume you're too weak to fight back. I didn't mention Fernandez by name. I didn't have to. Every person in that room knew exactly who I was talking about. Every person could see the calculation in Fernandez's eyes as he realized what was happening. Every person watched him go pale as I detailed, carefully, strategically, the ways a family could betray itself. And when I finished, the room erupted. Not in applause. In shock. In recognition. In the moment when everyone suddenly saw me again. The room shifted. Physically. Metaphorically. Everything. Eyes that had ignored me for months suddenly focused. Whispers that had been about my age and my irrelevance became whispers about Fernandez and his lies. People who hadn't defended me started asking questions. Respect returned. Not all at once but steadily. Then all of it. The kind of respect you earn when people realize you were never weak. You were just waiting. Fernandez's allies started distancing themselves. James suddenly remembered he had nothing to do with any of this. Christiana looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. And Mercy. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Recognition. Regret. Admiration. The woman I'd been, the soft, accommodating Margaret, wouldn't have gotten this moment. She would have stayed quiet. She would have protected their reputations to save face. But I wasn't that woman anymore. That woman had been erased. And in her place was someone far more dangerous. Someone who had nothing left to lose. He confronted me after the event. We were in the parking garage, just the two of us, and his mask finally dropped. His voice was sharp, dangerous. You planned this. You set me up. I looked at him, this man I'd created, and I smiled. Not a kind smile. Not a mother's smile. No, I said quietly. You did. I just showed everyone what you'd already done. For the first time in months, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. The kind that comes when you realize the person you thought was powerless was actually just patient. What do you want? He asked. The truth, I said. From everyone. All of it. I didn't ask for revenge. That would have been too easy. What I gave them was a choice. Accountability or exposure. They could step forward, admit what they'd done, explain why. Or I would make sure everyone knew the full details. Fernandez chose to fight at first. Until his lawyer told him what I had. Then he got very quiet. One by one they made their choices. Some confessed. Some apologized. Some tried to excuse it. But all of them had to face what they'd done. Had to be honest about it. That's power. Not crushing someone. Making them face themselves. Mercy finally spoke. She came to my house on a Tuesday and sat in my kitchen. The same kitchen where Fernandez had demolished my world months ago. And she cried. I'm sorry, she said. I was scared. And I understood. She'd been caught between her brother and me. And she'd chosen safety. It wasn't noble, but it was human. Will you forgive me? She asked. I looked at this daughter who'd abandoned me and realized something. Forgiveness wasn't about condoning what she'd done. It was about not carrying the weight of her cowardice anymore. Yes, I said. But you're going to understand, really understand what you did. And you're going to do better. She didn't stand beside Fernandez anymore. That mattered. It wasn't redemption, but it was the beginning of it. They all learned what I already knew. Age is not weakness. Age is memory. You remember every mistake you've ever made. You remember what people promised you. You remember who was loyal and who vanished. Age is patience. You don't react in the moment. You wait until the moment that matters. Age is strategy. You think 3 moves ahead because you've played this game before. Age is experience. You know what people are going to do before they do it because you've seen it before. That's what they'd underestimated. Not my strength. Not my intelligence. Just the accumulated power of having lived long enough to understand the game. I didn't take everything back. I didn't try to reclaim my office or my title or my position. I didn't need those things anymore. I discovered something more valuable. I didn't need them to prove my worth. Took enough. I took control of what mattered. My finances, my reputation, my freedom. I took the ability to walk away knowing I'd taught them something. Took peace. And I took power, real power. The kind that comes from understanding that you can walk away and that's enough. Power isn't possession. It's freedom. It's knowing you could destroy them if you wanted to, but choosing not to. It's being big enough that you don't need to keep score. 60. I was never weak. They taught me that age made women invisible. I taught them that underestimation has permanent consequences. They showed me that family could betray you. I showed them that betrayal requires a witness. And I was still here to witness it. I walked through my house that evening, the same house where this all started, and something was different. The furniture still belonged to everyone. The memories were still complicated. But I belonged to myself now. Completely. Fernandez would think about this every single day for the rest of his life. He'd remember the moment his mother walked to that microphone and became visible again. Christiana would never quite get back the relationship we used to have. James would always wonder if I knew everything he'd done. Mercy would spend years trying to prove she was better than her choice. And me. I discovered something that nobody could ever take away again. That I was stronger than I looked, smarter than they thought, and far more dangerous than a woman with nothing left to lose. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the first time they finally saw me. And I would never let them forget it again. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you have a story to tell, you're not alone here.